Have you ever caught yourself in a habit that you don't know why it is that you do? Have you ever caught that where you're doing something and it's like, why do I even do this? It's so disconnected from how it started that you can't even remember how you got there. You know, there was a conversation, my family's not together, all together, as much as we used to be. I have one away in college. And we had this conversation around Christmas this year that was, what is older, Jason's beard or my youngest son who just turned 11? And we were having that debate because he has no memory of me without a beard. And we started to look at pictures. Let's get some clarity on that. And I assure you that I did not have a beard when he was born, but very soon after that. So I've had a beard for probably a decade of my life. In fact, my middle son, last night, he's like, I don't think I remember you with a beard, or without a beard. And so I've had this beard for a long time. And I started to think as we were in this conversation, it's like, why did I ever start that? You know, what was going on? And you know, I know it doesn't always look like it, but I do try and keep it trimmed so that it doesn't look wild all the time. I get the loose hairs, and then every couple weeks I use a hair trimmer, you know, like you would use on your head if you had short hair, and I use that to trim my beard. And there's 3 different lengths that I do to trim my beard. There is, you know, places where it is a little longer, and a medium length, and a short length, depending on where it is on my face, right? You guys are laughing because you know how crazy, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. Not for a beard, because that was a feminine laugh, but for all, you know. But there was a lapse over the summer in my concentration, and so even though those different attachments for the trimmer are color-coded according to the length that you cut your hair, for some reason, I grabbed what was to be the shortest length, and I started to cut the hair that would be the longest. And so after that very first swipe went through, I thought to myself, this is going to be a very different day, right? You see, instead of having a beard, I had maybe just an evenly trimmed 5 o'clock shadow. That was kind of what was going on in my face. And I looked in the mirror, and I remembered, as soon as I finished, I remembered exactly why it is that I have a beard. You know, I'm not particularly fond of the shape of my face, and a beard gives me the opportunity to pick any shape that I want. And so I realized that I was gonna look a little, let's just call it chinless for a little while. So, but you know, it sometimes takes those moments where you realize that there are things that you do that you don't always know why it is you do them. And so today, we get to start a series. And not a series in the typical sense that we walk through a series here at Redeemer. These aren't a series of messages that are all going to fall in a row. Instead, this is a series that's going to allow us to invest in, to tackle, to recognize some of those practices that we have as a church that maybe we have forgotten because it is so long ago that we learned about them, or maybe it is that we've never fully understood why it is that we do the things that we do. The series is called Basics, and because this, in our particular tradition of church here at Redeemer, is the first Sunday of the month, and we observe and experience and practice communion on that first Sunday, the very first step into this is communion. We're going to take a closer look at communion so that we can better understand, and so therefore better experience what it is that's happening at communion here at Redeemer. Now, I want to be fair with all of you. For those of you who have been around Redeemer and maybe even had kids grow up in Redeemer, you know that we do this training with our 3rd and 4th graders, and we call it First Communion training. We get them ready to take that First Communion, and we step into that. But in addition to that, we do a refresher as part of our confirmation, as we talk about those things that are distinctly part of our church history as Lutherans. We talk about communion there. And both of those experiences have been greatly influenced by a particular Bible teacher around here by the name of Bill Strecker, who does that training in both those settings, and he does an excellent job. And so if you are familiar with those because you have been with your child at First Communion, or you've been with your child at confirmation, you will recognize some of what we talk about here today. But what I hope for is that there is a nugget, that there is something that hits you fresh today, that there is something that's different, that can draw you deeper into what it is that is communion. Because communion is so much more than what it looks like on the surface. You know, the place that we can start as we talk about this is something about the nature of God. We know two things about the nature of God. Actually, we learn many things about the nature of God, but I want to focus on two of them as we look at this thing called communion. The first is that God's nature is holy. And the definition of holy that we're using here, the one that is formed through our understanding of, in particular, the Old Testament, the beginning portion, the pre-Jesus portion of our Bibles, is that holiness is this expression of being that is without any type of moral failure. It's absolutely pure in morality, and then distinctly different from what is created. So this aspect of God, this nature of God that is absolutely holy. Now, where we get this theme runs all the way through the Bible, but in particular in the Old Testament, but where it maybe is clearest is at the very end of Moses' life, maybe the greatest leader, arguably the greatest leader for God's people. At the end of his life, he writes a song that expresses his appreciation, his glimpse into this very intimate relationship that he has with a God who is both holy and also has cared deeply for him and his people. And during that song, in one of the lyrics, he writes this: "He is the rock, his works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he." You see, everything about God is perfect. It's morally pure, incorruptible. He is flawlessly justified in the discipline that he gives to his children, his people, us. Because God's nature is holy. Our nature, on the other hand, is something just slightly different. You see, our nature, as we understand our nature, is something that was corrupted in the garden. Corrupted by a fruit and rebellion, and it yielded shame, and ultimately it yielded separation. As he constructs his case on Jesus Christ in his letter to the church in Rome, in chapter 8, Paul describes our flesh nature, our earthly nature, our sin nature. So when our sin nature runs into God's holiness, the two simply just can't occupy the same space. Now, there's this thing that we do in that third and fourth grade training for First Communion, where we take a look at an illustration that is oil and water. And on this table, I have very blue water, which did not come directly from the tap, just so that you can all feel safe. We want you to be protected online, and we also want you to be protected with your drinking water. But so this represents the holiness of God. And this is oil, vegetable oil, and when we put that in there, we can see that despite the fact that our brains want these two to combine together, that the oil exists completely separate from the water. Despite that they are in the same container, they remain separate. This illustration does not is not corrupted in the agitation that we can give to it. You see, very quickly after we agitate it, when we allow it to just have a moment, almost instantly, really, the oil once again rises back up to the top. And what we see here are two separate liquids. And that helps us understand how the holiness of God and the sin nature of man, how they can't occupy the same place. So this is where we come to the second nature of God today. There's this second nature of God. Maybe starting in this intimate connection that he has to his creation, mankind, you and I, that bears his image. So John, in his first letter to the church, he describes a seemingly paradoxical nature of God, character of God. And so in 1 John, we read these words, "Dear friends," and he's writing this to the church, "let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love God does not know God because," and this is the key, "God is love." How is it that God can be perfect in his holiness, justified in his wrath, and also be singularly loving and love? And I answer this in a way that I tend to like to answer things, because God is God and we are not. You see, God can be two things. He can be perfectly holy and he can be love. He can be both those things and he can be more. God's nature plays out in perfection. From creation, the creation of all of humanity, all of the earth, in creation, in the destruction of the flood, to the covenant he made with Abraham that ultimately reveals this perfect duality of God's nature, holiness and love. Holiness meant separation, but in love, God made a way. At first, that way in the garden, I'll bring you back there, that way looked a little like the covering of Adam and Eve in shame, right? Do we remember that story? See, Eve first took the fruit of the tree of good and evil, and she shared that with her husband or her mate in Adam, and together they knowingly were disobedient to God. And in that knowing disobedience, they were found by God. At first, they were hiding and they were covering their shame, their nakedness, because now they realized that they were shameful. And they covered with leaves. But God, he took and he killed animals so that they would have skins to cover their shame. And so that there was a first sacrifice to cover mankind's shame. God made a way. And over the history of God's people, that way of covering shame was refined, and there was all these different segments and ways to sacrifice so that the sin could be covered. And when we start to see and wonder, how is this connected to this thing that we do together, this practice that we have as a church, how does it have anything to do with communion? For that, we have to jump forward just a little bit in the story and get into the very first iteration of God's people that are in slavery of a mass kind. And they are enslaved in Egypt. And the slavery is particularly oppressive, so much so that the people of God call out to God and say, "Save us." And God hears them. And so God creates this system, creates this plan, executes this plan so that Pharaoh, the leader of these Egyptians, would let the people of God go. And so there are these series of plagues, these significant natural occurrences that afflict the people of the Egyptians in a way to persuade them to let God's people go. And so it starts with just turning water into blood. And from there, an infestation of frogs, and then lice, and then flies, and then sick livestock, and then boils, and then hail, and then locusts. And then finally, the final plague, the one that ultimately causes Pharaoh to release the people of God. The final plague is that the firstborn of every household would be killed. It actually says cattle as well. The firstborn son of every household would be killed. But God met with Moses, and he says that there's a way to distinguish yourself from all the others that live in Egypt, you Israelites, you who are my people. And so I have a plan for you on how you can distinguish yourself from everyone else. And so they were directed by God to take a lamb. And that they would take a lamb and that they would sacrifice that lamb. And then they would take the blood from that lamb and they would place it on their doorframe. So that when God, in the evening, almost midnight, when God would be going from house to house to afflict this incredibly tragic plague on families, that he would be able to identify those homes that he would pass over so that they would be spared this affliction of God. And ultimately, we know that as a result of that plague, that Pharaoh was finally enlightened, and he released the people of God, the Israelites, into the desert, into wandering, but ultimately into the promised land. And then at the conclusion of that moment in God's people's history, God decrees through Moses this is a day that you are to commemorate. This is what he says through Moses. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. A festival, a feast, was established by God and refined by his people, and it's known as the Passover feast. Or sometimes throughout the story of God's people, there's another name for the festival, and it's called the Festival of Unleavened Bread. And that's a connection to their hasty exit from slavery. They had to make bread that they wouldn't have to wait for it to rise so that they could get out of there as quick as possible. And the Passover meal was established so that the Israelites would never forget God's salvation from slavery. They were saved from slavery by God. And the Passover feast was how they would never forget that. And so we fast forward. We fast forward hundreds and hundreds of years and generations forward. And there's a man named Jesus. And he's sitting with his people, his disciples, his friends. And he is presiding over that Passover feast that was established all the way back when God's people were freed from slavery. He would have guided them through the symbols in the steps that told the story for the Israelites. It was an elaborate meal that carefully and perfectly shared the story of God's salvation. And on that evening, Jesus took what was a historical remembrance meal for the Israelites, and he transformed it into a forgiveness feast for the entire world. In Luke 22, we read this, and Jesus, this is him presiding over this meal. And Jesus took bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Every year of those lives, those disciples that were gathered with Jesus, they would have heard the story of how God had saved his people from slavery in Egypt. And those words would have been illuminated because they stood out as being completely different from any other experience that they had had in that meal. And Jesus was connecting his story with their history. What was a look back became so much more. Jesus reframed and established a new practice to experience God's salvation from sin. The details of this story were so familiar. It was the body of the lamb, a central figure in that feast that they were sharing, sacrificed in the account of the Passover. But instead, Jesus' body is the lamb of sacrifice. The promise of the Passover was that the lamb's blood, remember? It would mark the doorframes of the Israelites so that God would pass over and spare the life inside. But instead, Jesus was telling them, it's my blood that is the mark of a new covenant, a new promise. You see, Jesus takes what was a remembrance meal, and through the elements of bread and wine, he unleashes God's love through him and to the whole world. And so I think the easy step to take for us is this just a new remembrance meal? A way of remembering, instead of what Jesus did towards the very beginning of his people and saving them from slavery, that we are remembering what Jesus did for us on the cross and his resurrection. I would say yes, but somehow, mysteriously, so much more. I love a particular verse out of the letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and I quote it probably too often, but it is this, out of 1 Corinthians 4:1. "This then is how you ought to regard us, being followers of Christ," that's the us here, "as servants of Christ, and as those entrusted with the mysteries of God." Now, one of the first non-original languages. Remember, the Bible is written in both Hebrew and Greek. One of the first non-original languages that the Bible was translated into is a language called Latin. It was an educational language primarily. It's a dead language now. And that word that is mystery in English, mysterios in Greek, that word is translated as sacramentum into Latin. And that practice of communion in the church, we refer to that as a sacrament in the church. And so I want to invite you to hold tightly to the mystery, the God bigness, the beyond our intellect nature of God, to embrace that in this practice of communion. This way, we can't get tripped up when we read verses like John 6:51. You see, it's in John 6:51 where Jesus, this is long before the Passover, long before he is about to go to the cross, he is sitting and he is talking and teaching his disciples, and he says this, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." And then skipping forward, we read this: whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. And we can read that, holding tight to the mysteries that we know that are inherent in this thing that we do together called communion. And we can know that we are not cannibals. We can know that. We can know how funny it might seem to hear words like that, to be unfamiliar with the whole story and how they got there. But yet, still, remember, it's a mystery. And yet still, when we practice communion, we ingest the saving work of forgiveness that comes to us by Jesus Christ. We take it into our bodies, in the bread and the wine. Martin Luther explained it this way: Jesus Christ is fully present in communion. He's present in the elements. He's present with the experience. And he's present under, holding it all on a firm foundation. He is in, with, and under the bread and the wine. And so when the followers of Jesus in that first generation church were getting a little wild in their practice of communion, remember, they weren't all good-going church members who were responding to emails faithfully. There were some wild in the bunch. And so when they were celebrating this thing called communion, or the Eucharist is another terminology that is used for it, they were maybe imbibing a little bit more than they should, too much wine, maybe a little less sacred than they should. And the Apostle Paul, he provided some correction for them. He was reconnecting the practice of communion with its roots in Jesus. And at the very end of this corrective text, Paul writes these words, and it's 1 Corinthians 11:26. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. There are times when we use that as a benediction on communion Sundays in the church, as a way to send you out from this place, that whenever you eat from this bread or drink this cup, that you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. This reminds us that the benefits of communion are not limited to the individual receiving them. It's common. It is for all of us. The benefits of communion are for the whole of the church. This is why we have a practice here when we talk about communion, that we say this phrase or these phrases together. All are welcome to receive communion today. The only thing that we ask is that you have a living relationship with God through the power of Jesus Christ. And when the followers of Jesus practice communion, together in community, we receive, by grace, we receive forgiveness by grace in the presence of God. You see, it matters. It matters not just because it's a symbol, but because we step into the presence of God through the body, through the blood, through the bread and the wine, through the crackers and the juice. We step into the presence of God. And so right now, I just want to invite you into just a moment of prayer. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and bow your heads. And in your mind, but not out loud, I want you to think these words along as I say them. Lord God, I want to know that about you, not just in my mind, but in my heart. And so I invite you, Jesus, today. I invite you into my heart. I know that the sin in my life, my sin nature, I know that that separates me from you. But Lord, your word promises me that while you made a way that was sacrificed before, Jesus is the way for me today. And so, Lord, I pray that you would rule my heart and that you would fill me with the Holy Spirit so that I might follow you for the rest of my life. Amen.